Yeah, many thanks, Nathan and Peter, for having me here in this amazing space, and for the first time. I will, compared to yesterday at least, I will bring in a slightly different angle into our debate in focusing on the term social imaginary. And whether this term is timely or untimely, I don't know. At any rate, a few years ago, it was called a paradigm in the making by scholars like Susie Adams, Australian, or Chiara Potticci and others. And within that debate, the main reference figures are Cornelius Castoriadis, Paul Ricoeur, and Charles Taylor. And for me, especially the struggle with Castoriadis has been particularly important since a very long time. I associate him with a peculiar reading experience, which consists of a sequence of exclamations. Yeah? When I read the book, I have this, oh yes, 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 no. Yeah, so, and this is repeated over and over again. So I have this kind of, sort of very positive, but there are elements which, which are clearly no. And the no has been proven to be more productive for me. So, and the following lecture is also essentially about such a no, but this should not make us forget that there are also many yeses, and that even this no is still guided by deep respect for Castoriadis as a thinker, and his contribution for political thought cannot be valued highly enough. The shift within the conception of his thinking I would like to make has to do with the fact that I find it difficult to share his optimism with regard to the social imaginary without wanting to fall back into a fundamental pessimism. It is thus a question of why the world, despite the social imaginary, or perhaps because of it, is exactly the way it is, not particularly pleasant. So let's begin. The concept of a social imaginary is usually used in two ways. On the one hand, it can refer to existing political entities, like state or nation, and as such, it refers to their imaginary constructedness. For example, when famously Benedict Anderson speaks of a nation as an imagined community, in an anti-essentialist sense. On the other hand, however, it can also designate a special force that is supposed to break through the existing instituted political entities and to transcend them, thus making other and new such entities imaginable. Exemplary for such an understanding is Cornelius Castoriadis' attempt to grasp the social imaginary as an essentialistically understood radical imaginary that emerges from an uncontrollable magma of human imaginative powers. The anti-essentialist and the essentialist determinations of a concept hardly make a common perspective appear conceivable. And yet, such a perspective seems to me to be necessary in order to be able to grasp the political dimension of a concept more precisely. For the social imaginary undoubtedly characterizes not only a marginal area of modern political thought, for instance in the utopian tradition, but its core. That would be my argument. It still permeates the rhetoric of contemporary political activism with its emphasis on a new beginning and on another world that is possible, on a coming community, or on a pure event that is in store for us. Implicitly, I argue, it is present even in those central political concepts such as praxis and critique that we inherited from Marx, both of which in their own way sought precisely to avoid utopia. The problem we are facing here concerns in particular the fact that neither the essentialist nor the anti-essentialist understanding is able to do justice to this implicit dimension of the social imaginary as the core of modern political thought. They converge primarily in that they use the social imaginary as an explanatory principle meant to indicate both the instability or contingency of existing social relations and the possibility of their change by virtue of an inner necessity. We thus avoid considering the social imaginary as a phenomenon to be explained in itself, in order, for example, to be able to conceptualize both the peculiar stability of the unstable, typical for modern social relations, or the limitations of merely imaginary changes. That is, the social imaginary must very well be understood as a phenomenon to be explained in itself, whose specificity lies precisely in the fact that it can be understood both essentialistically and anti-essentialistically, and that in general ontological and historical determinations intersect in it, just as much as time diagnostic and future-oriented ones. In the following, I would like to sketch out a theoretical framework that is able to do justice to this particularity without being able or wanting to offer a common root, in the Heideggerian sense of essentialism and anti-essentialism. Such a frame of references presupposes three localizations, which I would like to outline briefly. And first, the social imaginary must be located in the conceptual field of a philosophical tradition between the terms Fantasia, Imaginatio, and above all Einbildungskraft. That's what we heard already a lot about. Can't go into detail here, just try to make 2 points. These terms primarily indicate subjective faculties, which, depending on the philosophical stake, can be understood more positively or negatively, epistemically or deceptively. A constitutively social dimension, that would be the second point, is attributed to them only late, especially in Kant's third critique. But even this attempt, around the terms common sense, subjective general interplay between genius and taste, ultimately fails to capture the particular dynamics and the functioning of the social imaginary in modernity. Above all, the overemphasis on creativity of a productive imagination in particular easily allows its specific negativity to disappear. The specific negativity of productive imagination concerns the ways of imagining what cannot or should not be, and it indicates the alignment of this negativity with a horizon of transcendence. The social imaginary, therefore, does not only concern those ways of imagining individuals generate about their social context or togetherness. That is, Charles Taylor's definition, very basic. Social imaginary is just what people think, in which kind of social context they live. But necessarily also what these ways of imagining reject in each case, and the goals to which they are oriented, to a different, a new, or a better living together. For this, I would say other concepts than that of imagination, social imagination, are needed. Secondly, it will be a matter of locating the concept of the social imaginary in the field of tension between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, or between subjective, objective, and absolute spirit. So the triadic models of thought of Hegelian or Lacanian provenance have the advantage that they do not simply make conceptual determinations, like Taylor does, social imaginary is this and that. Rather, they emphasize their transitive dimension in their respective interrelatedness. This implies not only a fundamental reciprocity of the subjective and the absolute, the imaginary and the rational, the merely imagined and the real, but moreover the formation of a mediating realm that is, the objective spirit or the symbolic, which indicates in particular the respective given structural or instituted conditions of thought and speech. That is, the triadic models of thought not only concern conceptual relations, but moreover their respective objectivations in social space, Vergegenständlichungen. Here it becomes clear that the social imaginary is not simply a subjective faculty, but that precisely as a subjective faculty, it is always already socially and historically, hence symbolically, marked. The fact that existing social and political units can be understood as forms of production of a social imaginary in their essentialist as well as anti-essentialist determination thus proves to be a mode of imagining of a specific historical social situation, that of modernity. So finally and thirdly, in this context, we must also examine the concept of praxis and critique in their internal relationality to the social imaginary. Their current omnipresence as discursive templates in activism and academia derives precisely from such objectifications, which even go so far as to no longer appear as instruments of implementation of the social imaginary, but seem to already embody it themselves in a specific way. So my argument is that praxis and critique are already, how we experience them today in a kind of mainstream way of use that they embody the social imaginary. The possibility for this lies in those determinations that the early Marx had made for both concepts, especially between the Paris manuscripts and the German ideology. For there, in a reinterpretation of the idealist concept of action, from Fichte and Hegel, praxis is defined as both a path and a goal at the same time. As a path in the sense of a revolutionary praxis, as a goal in the sense of a metabolic exchange with nature, through which the proletariat objectifies itself as a generic or species being, Gattungswesen of an emancipated humanity. So metabolism, generic or species being, Gattungswesen, and objectification, Vergegenständlichung are the three, main terms here, and they're all very weird. Those are really weird terms. In Gattungswesen, it's really very strange. And Vergegenständlichung is more or less a kind of positive turn of, Entäußerung or alienation. That's also very interesting. And Antonia might, with the Feuerbachian context where this comes from, more about that. But for me, those three terms, and also metabolism, at that time, Stoffwechsel was a very new term in science, in biology, chemistry. He was using in this kind of metaphorical way. So metabolism, generic being, and objectification are these three terms in which the social imaginary of a proletariat expands and essentializes itself here as a materialism in the sense of a cosmic natural imaginary. So the social imaginary is, founded in a cosmic natural, that is the Stoffwechsel, and an anthropological, the Gattungswesen. It is striking that at the same time, not only the concept of praxis, but also that of critique receives a specific metaphysical charge. It replaces, as it were, praxis in the sense of a postponement of action, just as Freud speaks of a postponement of thought in the case of negation, in the sense that the most rigorous and annihilating critique possibly appears already as a kind of political praxis. So in this understanding, critique is already praxis, which, as it were, is supposed to automatically indicate the change into the better. The negativity of critique thus becomes not so much the impetus on the way to revolutionary practice, but itself the goal from which the ultimate positive springs directly. That is, critique thrives on the prestige of a deeply essentialized notion of praxis without ultimately being able to stand up for it. And this, I fear, has not changed so much until today. Yeah? I think that one of the structural reasons for, this unease myself and I guess many people feel with how the term critique is now used nowadays, critical studies that everyone is, the success of criticality in a certain way, that it contains this promise to be already the solution, which I would say is definitely not true, So against this background, it seems to me all the more important to ask how the concepts of praxis and critique can be thought of differently, or whether and how the problematic inherent in them could be avoided. For if, in demarcation from early Marx, we want to understand neither praxis as simultaneously the path and the goal of pure positivity, nor critique is an instant of the negative that is supposed to trigger, as it were, automatically such positivity of praxis, then only one conclusion remains. Praxis as well as critique are necessarily indeterminate in their semantic dimension. Whatever we do, we cannot fix the meaning of this doing, and whatever we criticize, we cannot automatically turn with criticism towards the better. Criticism indeed is a praxis, a social praxis, and as such, it can mean very different things. It depends on the context. In each case, a moment of uncertainty remains, indicating that neither practice nor critique can ultimately understand themselves or become for themselves completely transparent. That is, the possibility of practice as well as critique remain tied back to this irritating moment of indeterminacy in a sense of the impossibility of an absolute self-understanding. And conversely, this impossibility of control, planability, the securing of values only determines the specific possibilities that are undoubtedly connected with practice and critique. So I would always defend these terms. I think they are absolutely important. There's no way to get rid of them. But we have to understand them, how they work and function. In order to sharpen the sense of these possibilities, the two concepts must be interpreted again and again, and the subjective, social, and ultimately also the cosmic, natural imaginary that is effective in them must be explicated, in the sense that both were symptomatic realizations which are unmistakable in the media and academic mainstream today, become comprehensible, as well as approaches that can be distinguished from them and are perhaps able to live up to their names. So how can the social imaginary be understood against the background of these three conceptual localizations? It may have already become clear that from what has been said so far that it can neither be simply generalized into the social as a mere subjective faculty of an imagination, nor can it be objectified as a quasi-objective or automatist structure in the name of practice and critique. However, the opposition that appears here already seems to belong to the matter itself. The social imaginary fluctuates constitutively between subjective and objective determinations. Marxian objectivism, for instance, in its rejection of utopia and in its reluctance to imagine communism concretely, already points to the discomfort with the imaginary understood merely subjectively. And conversely, the critique of Marx's objectivism, which I think is a very strong point in Castoriadis, easily falls back into a kind of psychologism, as can be clearly seen in Castoriadis. That is, subjective and collective, objective and imaginary and real determinations must be understood in their intrinsic connection and at the same time as reifications or objectifications of conceptual determinations in the historically social space. And this will be possible only with regard to the triadic models of thought of Lacanian or Hegelian origin. But what exactly causes the insufficiency of the imagination? The crucial point seems to be that even the protective imagination remains a synthesizing faculty that is able to generate new ways of imagining from existing elements such as perceptions or cognitive schemata. It can thus rise above the merely reproductive imagination. It cannot, however, create the absolutely new in the sense of a creatio ex nihilo. But this is precisely what praxis and critique are about. Yeah? And this is what, the essential meaning Castoriadis gives the social imaginary, yeah? In the sense of a creatio ex nihilo. And this is what praxis and critique are about, a kind of creative destruction, with the help of which something completely different or new is actually supposed to take place in comparison to the existing givens. But how can this very other be thought when it cannot be even imagined? So this is the problem. Yeah? If imagination is not enough, how can we think about something which we cannot imagine? Michel Foucault, following Maurice Blanchot, has identified a special term for that, in his famous essay of the Thinking of the Outside, from 1966. And he has identified a special force of attraction that can be understood as a correlate to the force of imagination. So that is my argument here, that the Einbildungskraft, force of imagination, needs this correlate in the force of attraction. It does not emanate from the subject and its faculties or powers, but from the transcendent itself by virtue of a special form of fascination. This attraction starts from that primal scene described by Blanchot himself, which he claims to have experienced as a child of 7 or 8 years, when the sudden and absolute emptiness of the sky revealed itself to him as an emptiness of God, which overwhelmed him with tears of a special joy and delight. From here came the self-imposed compulsion to, quote, think the other, to speak in relation to the other without reference to the self, without reference to the one, quote, end of quote. Here we are confronted in a quite anti-Kantian way with an experience that is not of this world and yet can only be had within it. We can only expose ourselves to such an experience and have to feel our presence as a denuded emptiness without any possibility of a positive relationship to it. This is the crucial point, this attraction, it comes, it's motivated by the outside and there is no, positivity possible towards it. This presence thus remains symbolically distinctly marked by that from which it is emptied. For the axial age, its concept of transcendence implies, as it were, in a kind of feedback, the world as a whole, and thus also a negative relationship to it. This is an argument I take from Blumenberg in his, legitimacy of a modern age, saying, that only the thinking of transcendence, makes immanence possible, because before is no, the gods, the ghosts, the ancestors were all there here, so there is no distinction between immanence and transcendence, and only with the idea of transcendence, immanence becomes thinkable. That's why we can't in the end not end up in immanence. So that's there is no immanence without transcendence. So it's a kind of logical problem here. And that means only in comparison, for example, with the Platonic ideas or principles, or with the divine spirit, the earthly sensuous world can be understood as deficient. Without this form of thinking of transcendence, consequently, there can be no criticism in the modern understanding and no driving force through the imagination that aims beyond the given. If the social imaginary aims at a completely different and new, at a beyond the given empirical conditions, and only in this it seems to be specifically modern, then it must be guided by such a force of attraction. Now, while imagination has the problem of acting beyond its conditions as a subjective faculty, attraction faces its own non-communicability, because any understanding of it would already presuppose a positive relation to the world. Thus, if we want to think a big other, an outside, an absolute, or a real, and at the same time communicate or implement it into the world, as implied by the notions of praxis and critique, into what relation must imagination and attraction be brought? Yeah? So this is the crucial question in a certain way. Is the notion of a mere interplay between the two terms sufficient here? I think maybe not. What is needed is a mediating category that allows us to distinguish the inner and the outer from each other and to relate them to each other in the first place. In the context of my consideration, such a category can only be thought of in connections with the objective spirit of Hegel or with the symbolic in the understanding of Cassirer, Lévi-Strauss, and especially Lacan, as the epitome of the existing forms of thought through which we can first form our ideas of subject, society, history, and world. In this view, the symbolic would not simply be a limitation of our imaginary by instituted laws and structures that we could break through by means of our imagination, and that is, the understanding Castoriadis has of the symbolic, and that's why he can make the imaginary, the social imaginary, so strong, or through which the real suddenly and completely abruptly bursts in from the outside. Rather, the symbolic understood in this way makes it possible exactly to imagine an outside, another absolute or real, which can break into the space of our imaginary conceptions precisely as an already symbolically imagined entity. The symbolic or objective spirit are necessarily positive conditions of the difference of imaginary and real, of subjective and absolute, and thus of every, that's a slightly hypertrophed argument of every form of negativity. The thinking of the outside can therefore be mastered neither by the imagination of the imaginary nor by the attraction of the real or through the real, but only by passing through the modern symbolic. For modernity, it is decisive that imaginary and real do not coincide, as in most forms of traditional thinking. Accordingly, the myth, for example, is not a symbolic form in a strict sense. So like for Cassirer, myth is the essential symbolic form. But I think he's wrong in this way because, myth doesn't distinguish the imaginary and the real. It is a kind of short circuit between the imaginary and the real. It knows no outside, has no transcendence, but also no real inside in the sense of a psychologically understood subjectivity. In comparison to this, it becomes clear how much only in modernity the symbolic spreads as an order of its own, keeping the imaginary and the real subject and substance at a distance from each other, and thus allowing neither a coherent worldview valid for all, nor a definitively given place in it for the individual. It is not surprising now that these increasingly isolated individuals perceive the specifically modern order of the symbolic as a kind of lack of subject-constitutive social and cosmological regularity, as an order or of disorder or as a crisis set in perpetuity. As much as modern sciences are concerned with laws of nature, social laws, laws of form or laws of value, to stabilize the order of the symbolic in a real, it is precisely the concept of law that clearly marks the difference from the objectivism of myth. For modern concepts of law are necessarily hypothetical as scientific boundaries, in their largely metaphorical transfer to social, economic, psychological, or cultural phenomena, they relativize themselves to habitual structural formations. In addition, social laws, as Lévi-Strauss rightly says, must be a priori and unconscious at the same time, which in turn indicates that they cannot be completely deciphered, even from a distant scientific viewpoint, especially in relationship to, one's own modern forms of law. Yeah? So Lévi-Strauss has this distant scientific viewpoint that he can analyze and make explicit the a priori and unconscious law of archaic societies, but he does not reflect his own standpoint. That is also, and obviously his argument must be related to his, own situation as well, where, and there's no argument about that. So the scientific position is taken out of the symbolic order, so to say. The very concept of law indicates how much the symbolic is our problem. Yeah, I think, and for me, and that is, lots of debate about, but for me, the real and the imaginary are not real problems. We are what we are, but the symbolic is the real problem. And that we, being all individuals, have no instrument to explicate the laws or regularities of our world. On the contrary, the symbolic establishes and manifests itself as a kind of framework precisely by allowing the subjective and the objective to drift further and further apart. Thus, the symbolic universe is expanding at the cost of a hysterical discursive figuration that determines our subjectivity at its very core. So the hysterical subject, which we are, can no longer orient itself to any lord or master, any transcendent given, to any cosmic, divine, or even human order. And then even where it does so in the illusion of expressing itself therein. For in order to be a subject, the individual must always first produce its subjective and an objective imaginary, but above all a social imaginary. And therein lies the specific imperative of the symbolic. Yeah? We are damned to imagine. Yeah, that is the imperative, which comparable to the conscience or the superego calls about the imaginary to present precisely an image of its own subjectivity, sociality, and also of the material world as a whole. The symbolic, however, does not simply invoke or call upon the imaginary to remedy the felt lack at the core of its subjectivity. Through a specific invocation of the imagination, it first constitutes the subject as a deficient one. It implements the lack as and in the subject, and thus constitutively lets the imaginary run into the void. The imaginary in the imagination cannot succeed or realize themselves. They cannot even learn from their repeated failure, because they can only act from the position of a subject and are always thrown back on it, which in turn implies that they can be relativized, questioned, or replaced at any time by another imaginary, another imagination, from another subject, simply. What is realized is precisely that in which the imaginary misses itself, its unintended effects or drifts, in which the structural formations crucial for the symbolic are deposited in the dimensions of the psychological, the social, or the material. It is in these particular sedimentations as psychological, social, and material qualities, and thus as realizations that are as unintentional as they are constitutively insufficient, that the modern symbolic also remains caught in the space of attraction by the real, of which I spoke earlier in reference to Foucault and Blanchot. This attraction owes itself to a pre-modern symbolic, we could say, as it were, which was formed in the age of transcendence, as Benjamin Schwartz has called it with regard to the Jasper's actual age. Accordingly, in modernity, we have not lost the outside and transcendence, rather we produce and reproduce them precisely as a lostness, as a kind of hallucination of the real. The social imaginary is thus symbolized in the field of tension between the imperative of the symbolic on the one hand, to mobilize one's own imagination as the epitome of a subjectivity that lacks something, and the ongoing attraction of the subjectivity by that which it itself negates, on the other hand, that is, by that which empties and undermines every conception of society and the world, the transcendence and the real. We must therefore understand modernity as a kind of symbolic form of production in which a double lack on the part of the subject and the imaginary, as well as on the part of the world and the real, becomes apparent. There is no objective or even absolute lack here that could be conceived in terms of a purely negative ontology, and of course no pure abundance beyond all lack. The special form of production of the symbolic consists rather in bringing forth an abundance of lack, and thus in making negativity as consequently as constitutively more positive. Against this background, it may become clear that society is by no means an imaginary institution. Yeah, that is the crucial definition by Castoriadis. Society is not an imaginary institution, but a symbolic form, or better, a form of the symbolic, which as such regulates the manifold imaginary stakes, as well as the intrusions of the real, and in doing so sediments itself empirically. The historically social, that is also a term by Castoriadis, and I think this is really very important because he is one of the very few political philosophers who addresses that as a problem, the historical social, is not simply the unfolding space of magma, but the basic structure of a modern symbolic. For this reason, history and society can by no means be understood in an anti-essentialist sense as imaginary constructs that we could easily change. Rather, we make change conceivable exactly in the first place. Yeah? Only because we have this symbolic, concepts of history and society, we can think, in myths. I mean, we also have Ovid or things like that, but that is natural changing things within the same order, but that we can change the order, we need the symbolic categories of society and history, and that's why I would say they are the deep structures, for infiltrating all other symbolic forms of modernity. Just as little, however, do we represent categories of a real. That's also, what history is, a history of class struggles or whatever, there are different determinations, what is the real dimension of history, the real goal. But I think that is all misleading. Yeah? And accordingly, there can be no historical or social ontology. Yeah? I think that is, this whole field of social ontology I find highly suspicious. There is ontology, social ontology, is a common term in many ways, but I think it's really, absolutely misleading. Yeah, there is no, social is symbolic and not, there's no way of ontologizing that, or at least not directly. Yeah, but obviously it's a question what kind of ontology is, is the symbolic, yeah, and how we can face that. The symbolic shapes its own elusive mode of being, which concerns neither purely subjective nor purely objective facts, but always both at the same time. And even if it primarily concerns the dimensions of meaning of empirical facts, it indicates at the same time that this meaning is always already realized, sedimented, or indeed instituted, as Castoriadis says. History and society are the categorical determinations of such a necessary contingency. So for me, it's not the real that has this quality of a necessary contingency, but the symbolic has it in a very strong and very direct way. History and society, they make collective spatial and temporal determinations that always already precede any individual desire for expression and locate it in the field of tension between internalized imagination and external attraction. As a phenomenon of the sedimented collective mind, the symbolic demands a thinking that is as subjective as it is absolute, and its cunning being that it always already prefigures both forms of thinking. Just as in Lévi-Strauss' words, the myths think in people without their knowledge, so the symbolic thinks in us moderns without being able to unlock or appropriate it completely. This means that we must and can only think historically and socially, even and especially where we want to go beyond such categories. As the basic structures of a symbolic history and society permeate and shape all other symbolic forms such as science and art, politics and economy, or law and religion in their specifically modern manifestations. The symbolic, therefore, not only regulates the individual imaginary claims in their relation to each other and to the real, it differentiates and dynamizes itself increasingly in its particular forms. The autonomy of the singular forms of science and art, politics and economy, law and religion can ultimately only be sought against the background of these frequently complementary divisions, which are often made between, functionalization in science, substantialization, in art, or imagination and rationalization, and between politics, economy, and so subjectivization and objectivization. But is autonomy of each individual symbolic form always already implies the demarcation from the other forms? Yeah. So this relationship is especially, I'm interested between art and science, for example. Yeah? So art is what science is not, and science is what is not art. So that's why, there always confusion about artistic research is coming from, that one thinks you can go easily between these boundaries, but, the symbolic boundaries reproduce themselves, institutionally in a very strong way. So that's completely imaginary, yeah. But still, it's an interesting field where we can make up these distinctions. Yeah? So to argue against functionalization in the name of substantial autonomy, as Castoriadis does, and I think this is his basic argument, fails to recognize these dependencies, and thus the divisions that always already underlie any autonomy. The symbolic is the production form of such divisions which are not recognizable within the discursive autonomy of the individual symbolic forms. To grasp these forms of production, and thus the symbolic order of modernity as a whole, would require a knowledge of the processes of division themselves and a thinking of the symbolically generated gap, the rift or divisiveness as the precondition of every imaginary articulation and every mode of appearance of a real. I call it ein Wissen der Spaltung, a knowledge of a split. Such a knowledge cannot be categorically positivized. Is that a word? Cannot made, positive in a certain way. However, it has long since itself formed a specific experiential space, and therein made possible those crucial historical conceptualizations of idealist philosophy and of psychoanalysis, that at least allow us to address the symbolic or the objective mind. We should, however, not make the mistake of taking these conceptual determinations for actual or factual ones, and thus for successful absolute or real forms of knowledge, that means for truth. There's no truth in the symbolic, in that sense, in a strict sense. They merely indicate the dimension of a problem. I think that is what relates the symbolic to unconscious, although I think they're different. Symbolic comes from this idea of a collective unconscious, what Jung and other people have promoted, but I think that is difficult term to understand. I would prefer just to make an equivalent. It's similar in a certain way, but it's not identical. I come to a conclusion from here that is from a theory of a symbolic order of modernity in its fundamental structures of history and society. Can a political dimension of the social imaginary be determined at all? So that is necessarily completely, ending up in relativism. It seems to me indeed difficult to think of an immediately anarchic or even communist imaginary as a form of successful autonomy. At least no simple we-ideal, the evocation of some form of collectivity seems to be sufficient to reflect the respective symbolic conditions and consequently the negative acts of demarcation associated with them. The negativity of the imaginary often seems to short-circuit with the imaginary of negativity. But precisely because autonomy today is thoroughly symbolically mediated, that is essentially determined by the instances of history and society, and which is why autonomy cannot be achieved as an actual empirical social reality, it necessarily requires specific forms of praxis and critique, that is, instances of positioning within the singular symbolic realms. I think there's no other way than, acting out and from the symbolic categories, like politics, your art, or culture, whatever, even the economy in a certain way. Therefore, the social imaginary must not be misunderstood as a self-acting force that will lead to the good end on its own. And I think that's the implication of Castoriadis, that the magma will find its way. We can be confident about that, and I think we cannot. Rather, it must expose itself to practice as well as critique, and consequently, to a certain degree, to the logic of symbolic differentiation. In this sense, the anarchic and the communist imaginaries can be understood as incorporating important historical and social experiences, that for sure, but probably not representing pure truth events or things like that. The decisive question, however, for the respective positionings of practice and critique will be whether we merely aim at the discursive self-reproduction of a singular symbolic forms, as official politics or science or art, things like that, or whether they succeed in at least keeping alive the question of coherence as a symbolic order. This does not imply an overcoming or transgression of singular symbolic forms towards successful totality, but a work on or through the symbolic. And that's the terms were both, like the Hegelian Arbeit am Begriff, work on, or, how Blumenberg took it, Arbeit am Mythos, tried to actualize it, and the psychoanalytic working through, Durcharbeiten. So again, on this practical side, I think the Hegelian and the psychoanalytic concepts are crucial. And such a working through the symbolic that starts at the irresolvable tension between the empirical, politically artistic, or scientific manifestations and the transcendental dimensions of meaning. Hence, precisely because politics, art, and science or philosophy cannot embody the unconditional or autonomous sense, and thus cannot remedy the symbolic lack of totality, they generate and instigate specific forms of praxis and critique. For them, imagination is clearly not enough. They will always need that force of attraction to explore their own potentials in order to at least envision the radically new. And within the triad of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, it is clearly the symbolic which counts, not as a solution for their goals, for the goals of praxis and critique, but as a problem intrinsic to themselves. And that's why I would say, practice and critique, or especially political practice, needs this kind of reflection. And our problem is in many ways that it lacks that kind of reflection, needs that kind of reflection about its own, status as a praxis. But the praxis is not the goal already. It's not the emancipated, humanity. It's always a certain state within a certain symbolically marked field. And that's what, try to do that in the art world or so. It would also be really important in the political world to have a stronger emphasis on that. And finally, to live up to their name as political, artistic, social, or psychological practices, or psychoanalytic practices or critiques, in their respective empirical contingency and fallibility, they simultaneously have to perform a certain necessity, I would say, the necessity of thinking something beyond their own reach. Let's call it an idea of symbolic unity. Okay, thank you.